In the name of the Creator, Redeemer, and life-giving Spirit. Amen. For those of us who lived through the 1960s, the past few months have been especially difficult. The anger in public discourse and the threats of violence are palpable. And last week was especially hard. The violence that had been lurking just below the surface erupted in a big way in Utah with the killing of Charlie Kirk. Now, I didn't know who Charlie Kirk was until he was killed. I know now that I didn't agree with practically anything he had to say, but I don't believe that he should have been killed because of his beliefs. Just as Bobby Kennedy, or Dr. King, or Medgar Evers, or JFK, or the 3 civil rights workers should have been killed for what they stood for in the 1960s. We are in a period in which public life is marked by violence, assassinations, assassination attempts, cycles of grief, and the dangerous lure of retribution. In such times, it is tempting to despair or to match insult with insult, violence with violence. But as people of faith, we know that there is another way, and we see that way in today's readings. The prophet Amos denounces injustice. The psalm for today lifts up God's care for the poor. Paul calls the church to pray for all leaders. And Jesus demands faithful stewardship in the face of crisis. The words resist despair and vengeance, and instead insist on the transformative power of justice, prayer, and hope. These passages remind us that our place is to stand at the margins, where grief is heaviest, and to embody God's mercy in the midst of political violence. As scholar Walter Brueggemann wrote, the prophetic voice disrupts the numbness of a culture bent on violence and evokes an alternate consciousness of justice and compassion. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the readings. Amos is one of the most uncompromising voices in the Hebrew Bible. Speaking in the 8th century before the Common Era, he confronted a prosperous but unjust Israel, while the wealthy trampled on the poor. Hear this, he said, you trample on the needy and bring ruin to the poor of the land. He indicts those who manipulate markets, cheat with false balances, and treat the vulnerable as commodities to be bought and sold. And he declares God's judgment. Surely I will never forget any of their deeds. Brueggemann notes that prophets like Amos disrupt what he calls the royal consciousness, the ideology that normalizes exploitation and shields the privilege from criticism. Amos shatters the illusion, insisting that God takes the side of the oppressed. His words are not just about ancient Israel. They speak directly to a modern world where political violence often serves economic interest and where the poor pay the heaviest price. For those of us who follow Jesus, our task is to speak plainly about the systems, economic, political, and cultural, that foster cycles of despair and bloodshed. Political assassinations are rarely random acts. They are born of a culture where power is idolized and human dignity is disposable. We must see these dynamics clearly and proclaim that God's justice will not be mocked. Today's psalm paints a radically different picture of power. God raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap, declares the psalmist. In a culture of retribution, this psalm insists that God's power is revealed not in destroying enemies, but in restoring dignity. One writer observed that Christian hope is not rooted in the denial of suffering, but in God's promise to bring new life out of ashes. In the aftermath of violence, when communities are left in the ash heap of grief, the psalmist testifies that God is near. In today's epistle, Paul's instructions seem almost naive in our current political climate. I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings, and all who are in high places. Now, this command was not given in an era of benevolent rulers. Roman Empire emperors persecuted Christians. Paul was not naive. He was radical. To pray for leaders, even unjust ones, is to resist the cycle of hatred and to acknowledge God's ultimate sovereignty. One commentator argues that reconciliation begins not with the erasing of injustice, but the willingness to hold even one's enemies within the embrace of God's love. Prayers for leaders, even corrupt or violent ones, is not acquiescence. It is an active resistance to retribution. The gospel for today presents one of Jesus' most challenging parables, a story that on its face is about money. As one scholar noted, Honorable Father Justin, Jesus talked more about money more frequently than he did about anything besides the kingdom of heaven. More than 1/3 of his parables have something to do with money. Clearly, he understood the power of money and the corrupting effect the pursuit of wealth has on people and societies. This parable insists that how we handle worldly possessions reflects our readiness for God's kingdom. The story is a bit puzzling. The manager is accused of squandering his master's property. The master fires the manager and demands an accounting. Instead of making amends by collecting more from debtors, the manager does the exact opposite. He goes to the workers and reduces the debts they owe to the master. To this reader, it looks like he continues to squander the master's resources. In reality, however, he has reduced or eliminated the burden of debt on the people who owed money to the master. He has lifted them up, even though his intention was to ingratiate himself with the workers for his own benefit. This parable does not approve of dishonesty, but rather commends urgency, creativity, and foresight in preparing for God's kingdom. The manager uses the limited time and power he has left to ensure his survival. Whatever his motives were, by reducing the debts, he improved the economic situation of the workers. Jesus lifts up this metaphor for disciples. Use the resource of this world, money, influence, social capital, in the service of justice, mercy, and relationships, not for selfish gain. The main point of this passage is this: wealth is not neutral. It demands a choice. We too have a choice. In this difficult time in our history, will we succumb to the pressure of greed or despair or alienation? How might we fight back? There are practical things that we can do. Go to a protest. Give money to those who are on the front line, who are fighting injustice in the courts. Bear witness to injustice. Feed the hungry. As part of a community of faith, we are equipped to fight despair by knowing that what is right, what is true, and what is just will ultimately prevail. Amen.